No one in the town went to bed early that night, not because something felt wrong, but because everything felt too normal. The sun had slipped behind the low hills, just as it always did. Porch lights blinked on one by one. The diner on Main Street was closing, the smell of fried onions still hanging in the air. Children's voices faded as screen doors slammed shut. It was an ordinary American evening, the kind no one remembers. And that was exactly why it worked. What no one knew was that the decision had already been made. Not that morning, not that week, months earlier, in rooms the town would never see. The first knock came just after 9:40 p.m. It wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive, it was precise. By the time the second door was knocked, word had already started spreading. Not through phones or radios, but through something older and more reliable. Instinct. People looked through curtains. They paused mid-sentence. Dogs began to bark, confused by unfamiliar footsteps moving with purpose. The men at the doors all looked the same. Dark jackets, no visible insignia, calm faces trained to reveal nothing. They spoke politely, too politely. You need to pack essentials only. You'll be leaving tonight. This is not optional. Naturally, the questions came. Why? For how long? Where are we going? None of them were answered. Some residents thought it was a drill. Others assumed a fire, a gas leak, maybe a train derailment nearby. A few whispered about war. It was that kind of decade. But every explanation collapsed under the same cold sentence repeated again and again. You are not authorized to ask that. By 10:30 p.m., the town was awake. Lights flooded windows. Cars started and stopped. Suitcases appeared on porches. Too small for a life, too big for a night. Inside homes, hands shook as drawers were opened and closed again. Unable to decide what mattered enough to survive displacement. Photographs were taken off walls. Pets were leashed or left behind. Meals were abandoned half-eaten on tables. And still no sirens, no fire, no visible danger. Only urgency. At the edge of town, military trucks waited with their engines running. Not hidden, not dramatic, just present. As if they had always belonged there. No one was told to lock their doors. No one was told they would return. By midnight, the streets were full of people standing quietly beside what little they were allowed to take. Some cried openly. Others stood frozen, faces emptied by shock. A few tried to argue, but arguments require an opponent, and there was none. Only procedural. Children asked when they were coming back. No one answered them either. As the convoy began to move, something strange happened. The town didn't erupt into chaos. It fell silent. The sound of engines replaced conversation. Gravel crunched beneath tires. Porch lights stayed on, illuminating empty steps and forgotten shoes. Wind moved through trees that had no idea. They were about to outlive everyone who named them. And just like that, the town was gone. Not destroyed, not burned, not evacuated with headlines and cameras. Simply removed. By morning, the roads would be blocked. By the end of the week, the signs would come down. By the end of the year, maps would pretend the town had never existed. But that night, as the last vehicle disappeared into the dark, one question lingered in the air, unanswered and dangerous. What could be so important that an entire town had to disappear overnight? And why could no one ever speak of it again? By morning, the town officially no longer existed, not because it had been destroyed, but because it had been redefined. The buses stopped just before dawn. The people were unloaded in silence, counted in clipped voices, then herded into temporary shelters that smelled of disinfectant and cold metal. No signs, no welcome, no explanations, only forms. Names were written down, addresses were crossed out, questions were ignored. The first thing everyone noticed was the absence of clocks. Time, it seemed, was no longer relevant. Someone eventually asked a question that had been building all night, not shouted, not emotional, just quiet and reasonable. Why were we moved? The answer came instantly. too instantly, "You are not authorized to ask that." It wasn't said with anger. It was said with training. Over the next hours, the same questions surfaced again and again, from different mouths in different tones. Parents, elderly men, a woman clutching a child who hadn't spoken since the truck stopped. Each time the response never changed. Not "we don't know," not "we'll tell you later," not "for your safety." Just "you're not authorized to ask that." By noon, people began to notice something else. They were being separated, not dramatically, not forcefully, quietly. Families were split into different rooms for processing. Neighbors who had lived door to door for decades suddenly found themselves assigned to different locations. When someone asked to stay with a relative, the request vanished into paperwork. And paperwork, it turned out, was the real authority. The documents handed out that afternoon were thin. Too thin for an event of this scale. No official seal. No specific agency named. Just generic language and a signature that looked copied rather than signed. One line appeared on every page. "This relocation is permanent until further notice." No one remembered agreeing to that. As the day dragged on, rumors filled the silence left by the lack of information. Chemical spill, experimental weapons, a buried mistake that had finally been noticed. Each theory spread quickly and collapsed just as fast, because none of them explained the secrecy. If it were dangerous, why no warnings before? If it were urgent, why no sirens? If it were temporary, why erase the town? Late that afternoon, a man who had worked at the town hall for 23 years noticed something chilling. His file listed his place of birth correctly, but his place of residence was marked unknown. Not former, not evacuated, unknown. Others checked their papers. The same word appeared again and again. It was as if the town had slipped into a bureaucratic blind spot. Not destroyed, not acknowledged, simply unrecorded. That night, someone tried to leave the shelter. They didn't get far. There was no violence, no shouting, just a calm redirection back inside, accompanied by the same sentence spoken with practiced politeness. "This area is restricted." Restricted from what? From whom? No one said. As darkness fell, exhaustion set in. Children slept on folding cots. Adults stared at ceilings, replaying the knock on the door, the rushed packing, the unanswered questions. Some whispered plans to contact the press. Others talked about lawyers. But deep down, a more unsettling thought was forming, one no one wanted to say out loud. What if there was no one to complain to? Because the more documents they saw, the clearer it became. This operation didn't want to be visible. It didn't want witnesses, and it definitely didn't want explanations. It wanted compliance. And somewhere, buried beneath layers of forms and silence, the truth waited. Not large, not explosive, but precise. Because whatever had happened in that town was never meant to be discussed. The rumors didn't start in the shelters. They had existed long before the evacuation, buried beneath everyday life, dismissed as coincidence, laughed off as small-town imagination. Only now, with the town gone, did they begin to make sense. There had always been places people avoided. A stretch of land behind the old high school where grass refused to grow. A basement on the east side that flooded even in dry summers. A low, constant vibration some residents swore they felt at night. Not loud enough to hear, only to notice when everything else was quiet. Before, these things were ignored. Now they felt deliberate. In the days following the evacuation, a few former residents began comparing memories. Not publicly, quietly, in corners of shelters, in whispered conversations that stopped when staff passed by. Someone remembered construction crews arriving years earlier, escorted by men who didn't wear company logos. Another recalled utility workers, replacing perfectly functional lines without explanation. A third spoke about restricted areas that appeared overnight, fenced off with no posted reason. None of it had ever made the news. One man, a retired surveyor, remembered something more precise. He had been asked, unofficially, to review soil reports from beneath the town decades ago. The data didn't align with surface conditions. Density readings were wrong. Layers were missing. It was like the ground had been rearranged, he said. At the time, the request disappeared. So did the files. What troubled people most wasn't the idea of a secret. It was the timeline. If something dangerous existed beneath the town, why wait so long? Why allow generations to live, raise families, build schools? Unless the danger wasn't immediate, unless it was contained. That word began to circulate. Contained? Late one night, a former maintenance worker finally spoke. He admitted that during routine repairs years earlier, he had encountered a sealed access door beneath a municipal building. No markings, no locks anyone recognized, just a smooth surface cold to the touch, humming faintly. When he reported it, he was reassigned the next day. No explanation, no follow-up. Others added their pieces. Strange power fluctuations, nighttime convoys moving through town without headlights, survey teams appearing after storms, as if checking something unseen. Individually, these moments meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern. Meanwhile, outside the shelters, activity intensified. Satellite imagery later showed increased movement around the abandoned town. Temporary structures erected, roads resurfaced, checkpoints installed. The area was officially labeled under environmental review. Environmental review didn't require armed patrols. The more people remembered, the more unsettling the realization became. The evacuation hadn't been a response. It had been a final step. Whatever lay beneath the town wasn't new, it wasn't sudden, and it certainly wasn't accidental. Someone had known for a long time, and now, for reasons no one explained, the decision had been made to remove the variable that couldn't be controlled. The people. That night, one former resident tried to piece together old maps from memory. Streets that no longer aligned, buildings that never quite matched their blueprints. A town designed to look ordinary, while hiding something deeply unordinary below. The most disturbing thought came quietly, almost gently. What if the town had never been meant to last? As dawn approached, guards rotated shifts outside the shelters. Inside, no one slept well. Dreams filled with hollow spaces beneath familiar homes, with doors that led downward instead of out. And beneath all of it, lingered the same unanswered question. Heavier now, more dangerous. If something was hidden under the town, why was silence considered safer than warning? At first, the silence seemed temporary, a natural reaction to shock. People assumed that once lawyers were called, once journalists noticed, once the right questions reached the right desks, the truth would surface. That was how things worked. That was how they had always worked. But days passed, then weeks, and the silence didn't lift. It spread. Some former residents simply stopped answering calls. Others moved without leaving forwarding addresses. A few changed their names, not legally, quietly, socially, as if erasing themselves in small, careful ways. The most unsettling cases were the ones who remained but refused to speak. A school teacher who had once led community meetings now avoided eye contact. A volunteer firefighter declined interviews he had previously agreed to. Parents redirected conversations the moment their children asked about the town. "It's better not to remember," one mother said. Not with anger, with fear. Doctors later described it as trauma. Acute stress response, collective shock. All accurate and yet insufficient, because the silence wasn't uniform. It had edges. People were willing to talk about leaving, about the night, about the confusion. But whenever the conversation drifted toward why, something changed. Voices lowered, hands tightened, words vanished mid-sentence. It was as if the question itself carried weight. In one documented case, a man began recounting his memories to a local reporter. He spoke calmly, clearly, until he reached the moment the door was knocked on. Then he stopped. His breathing changed. His pupils dilated. He asked for water. The interview ended there. The reporter never published the story. Another former resident wrote a detailed letter to a state representative. 27 pages, carefully typed, fact-checked, referenced. It was mailed, then mailed again. No response ever came. Months later, The representative denied receiving it. Community groups attempted to organize reunions. Not protests, just gatherings. Every attempt quietly collapsed. Venues became unavailable. Permits were delayed. Emails went unanswered. No one issued a ban. No one had to. The pressure was invisible but precise. Meanwhile, official language began appearing in unexpected places. Mental health pamphlets, employment forms, housing assistance documents, phrases repeated across agencies, across states. Do not revisit the event. Focus on present stability. Speculation may cause harm. None of it was mandatory. All of it was clear. The unspoken message settled in slowly. Remembering was dangerous. One former resident, an elderly woman, was the exception. She spoke freely, openly, without hesitation. She told anyone who would listen about the fences, the trucks, the doors beneath the town. She was dismissed as confused, then as senile, then as unreliable. When she passed away, her stories passed with her. As time went on, something else emerged. Something quieter, harder to document. Children who had been evacuated too young to understand began, exhibiting shared behaviors, night terrors, aversion to basements, anxiety around enclosed spaces. None of them remembered the town clearly, but their bodies did. By the second year, the silence was complete. The town was no longer discussed, not because it was forbidden, but because speaking about it no longer felt safe, not legally, emotionally. Whatever had been hidden beneath the town had done more than displace people. It had reshaped memory, and in that reshaping, a final unsettling possibility took form. What if silence wasn't just encouraged, but engineered? The first sign wasn't dramatic. It was administrative. A former resident tried to update his driver's license. The clerk typed in the town's name, paused, frowned, and tried again. "It's not coming up," she said. At first, he thought it was a glitch. Databases failed all the time. But when he offered the zip code, the screen remained blank. When he pointed to a printed utility bill, the clerk looked uncomfortable, as if he had handed her something inappropriate. "I'll need a different proof of address." Different from what? From a place that no longer officially existed. Within weeks, others noticed the same problem. Insurance policies flagged inconsistencies. Birth certificates listed hometowns that systems refused to recognize. School transcripts referenced districts that had no current records. It wasn't just inconvenient, it was destabilizing. Without a recognized place of origin, people found themselves explaining their own existence over and over, to employers, to banks, to doctors. Each explanation sounded less believable than the last. Some stopped trying. Meanwhile, online maps updated quietly. Satellite images blurred. Road names disappeared. What had once been a clearly labeled town became an anonymous stretch of terrain. No marker, no warning, no history. Printed maps followed. New editions omitted the town entirely. Old ones became curiosities, outdated, unreliable, quietly discarded. Libraries received revised catalog instructions. Archivists were told to reclassify materials pending verification. Local newspapers found gaps in their own microfilm records, entire weeks missing as if never printed. No recall was announced, no correction issued. The erasure happened not with force, but with updates. What disturbed people most was how ordinary it all felt. No secret agents, no midnight raids, just systems doing what they were designed to do. Overwrite inconsistencies. And the town was now the inconsistency. A historian later described it as soft deletion. Nothing visibly removed, everything gradually inaccessible. Attempts to preserve evidence grew desperate. Boxes of photographs were scanned, uploaded, shared, then quietly removed for policy violations. Websites disappeared overnight. Forums closed without explanation. Even memory began to feel unstable. Former residents disagreed on details they once knew intimately. Street names shifted. Building locations blurred. The town's shape softened at the edges, like an image copied too many times. Reality was losing resolution. The most chilling moment came when a federal document surfaced. Briefly, it referenced the region, not as a town, but as a former residential anomaly. Anomaly, not a community, not a settlement. An error. By the time anyone tried to save the document, it was gone. What remained was absence. Structured, maintained, intentional absence. The town had not been destroyed. It had been edited out, and with every record removed, every map corrected, the question became harder to answer and more dangerous to ask. How do you prove something existed when the proof itself has been erased? It took years before anyone tried to go back, not because they couldn't, but because they weren't sure they should. Life had moved on unevenly. People found new towns, new jobs, new routines. Children grew, accents softened, memories blurred at the edges. On the surface, the evacuation became a footnote, something that had happened, not something that was still happening, until the restrictions quietly changed. No announcement, no explanation, just a line removed from a database, a checkpoint that no longer stopped cars. Someone noticed first by accident. A former resident, driving cross-country, took a familiar exit out of habit, then realized no one was there to turn him around. The road was open. The town wasn't marked, but it wasn't blocked either. Word spread slowly, cautiously, not through posts or headlines, but through phone calls and half-finished sentences. I went back. What did you see? Everything. Houses still stood, paint faded but intact. Curtains hung where they had been left years earlier. A bicycle lay on its side in a yard, rusted into place. Calendars inside homes still marked the month they had left. Dates frozen mid-life. The silence was total. No birds, no engines, no voices. Only wind, moving through structures built for people who never returned. Inside the houses, dust softened every surface. Plates sat where meals had been abandoned. Shoes waited by doors. Children's drawings curled on refrigerator doors, yellowed but untouched. Nothing had been looted, nothing vandalized. It was as if the town had been sealed, not abandoned. Some former residents couldn't go inside their old homes. They stood in doorways, overwhelmed by the feeling that they were trespassing in their own lives. Others walked room to room, touching walls, opening drawers, counting what had been left behind. Every house told the same story. Departure without closure. What unsettled visitors most was the condition of the infrastructure. Power lines had been removed carefully, pipes capped. No signs of decay one would expect after years of neglect. Maintenance had continued. At the edge of town, new structures stood where none had been before. Low, nondescript buildings, fresh gravel, fences without signs, no guards, no explanations. People noticed faint humming again. The same vibrations some remembered from before, barely perceptible, constant, as if something beneath the ground was still active. Someone opened the old school. Desks were aligned, chalkboards clean, a lesson plan still pinned to the wall, dated the week of the evacuation. History had paused. As night fell, a few stayed longer than planned. Curiosity overpowered caution. They walked streets in the dark, guided by moonlight and memory. Then, without warning, lights flickered on. Not in houses, in the new buildings. White, steady, watching. No one slept in the town that night. They left before dawn unsettled, carrying photographs and fragments of proof, but also a heavier realization. The town had not been forgotten. It had been preserved, and preservation only makes sense when something is expected to be used again. The first acknowledgement came disguised as clarification. A short statement appeared on a government website. No press conference, no headline placement. It addressed public confusion regarding a former residential area. No town name was mentioned. The language was clinical, carefully limited. It described temporary relocation measures, taken years earlier due to environmental and infrastructural considerations. Temporary. Former residents read the word over and over. Temporary suggested an endpoint, one that had never been announced. Requests for further information were met with standardized responses. Departments redirected inquiries to one another. Phone calls ended in polite loops. But something had shifted. For the first time, officials were no longer denying the town's existence. They were redefining it. Documents followed, redacted. Heavily summarized reports leaked through Freedom of Information requests. Pages blacked out. Sections labeled not applicable. What remained spoke in abstractions. Subsurface instability, long-term observation protocols, population density variables. No mention of families. No mention of schools. No mention of lives interrupted. One technical memo referenced auditory phenomena reported prior to relocation. Description was brief, dismissive, categorized as non-harmful resonance. Residents remembered the sound differently. They remembered sleepless nights, headaches, the sense that the ground itself was awake. Another document acknowledged structural preservation actions undertaken post-relocation to maintain site integrity. Preservation? That word again. When pressed, an agency spokesperson confirmed that access restrictions had been relaxed, but advised against extended visits. No reason given. Local officials, previously silent, began offering personal recollections, cautiously. One admitted the evacuation order had come from above, late at night, with no room for questions. Another recalled being told explicitly not to use the town's name in correspondence. There were scripts, he said. We were told what to say if people asked. Community meetings were held, sparsely attended, tense. Former residents sat in folding chairs, listening to carefully worded apologies that never quite admitted fault. No one said, "We were wrong." No one said, "We knew." Instead, they said, based on the information available at the time. The most revealing moment came during a closed-door briefing later summarized in notes. A single sentence stood out. The site remains active. Active. Not dangerous. Not resolved. Active. Questions followed. What kind of activity? For how long? For what purpose? The answers never came. Instead, funding allocations quietly renewed. Maintenance contracts extended. Environmental monitoring increased. The town was no longer erased. It was classified. And a classification meant intent, which led to the question everyone avoided, but everyone felt pressing closer. What happens when an experiment ends, but the subject is still there? The witnesses did not come forward at once. They waited years, some out of fear, others because they lacked the language to explain what they had experienced. Most had tried to move on. They changed jobs, changed states, changed names in some cases, but certain sensations followed them, unchanged by distance. It started subtly, a low-frequency hum, barely audible, resurfacing in quiet rooms. Pressure behind the eyes, a faint vibration in the chest when standing still too long. Doctors found nothing. Tests came back normal. Symptoms were labeled stress, anxiety, coincidence. But the similarities between accounts were impossible to ignore. Once people began comparing notes, they described the same sound, the same timing, the same physical responses. One former resident reported waking at exactly 2:17 a.m. every night for months, heart racing, ears ringing. Another experienced nosebleeds without cause, always after dreaming of the town. Children were affected differently. Those who had been very young during the evacuation developed unusual sleep patterns. Some spoke in precise adult language while dreaming. Others drew repeated images of underground spaces, tunnels, chambers, things without names. Psychologists struggled to categorize the behavior. A retired engineer who had lived near the town's perimeter eventually spoke publicly. He described equipment installed underground in the final years, devices he did not recognize, maintained by teams that did not wear identifying insignia. They said it was monitoring, he recalled, but they never said what. Several witnesses recalled being instructed not to talk about the sound. Not formally, no signed agreements, Just quiet warnings delivered by people who seem to know too much. You don't want to focus on that, they were told. It's nothing. But the body disagreed. Years later, during the return visits, some reported symptoms intensifying. The hum grew stronger, headaches sharpened, electronic devices malfunctioned, batteries draining, recordings distorting. One audio file captured during a nighttime visit contained a rhythmic pulse beneath the ambient noise. Analysis revealed a pattern. Not random, not mechanical, intentional. The most disturbing testimony came from a woman who had been pregnant during the evacuation. Her child, now an adult, exhibited heightened sensitivity to sound and vibration. He could detect frequencies others could not. He reacted physically to places, becoming nauseous, disoriented. Particularly near the old town site, medical explanations fell short. What united the witnesses was not hysteria, but consistency. Independent accounts, aligning across decades, locations, and demographics. This was not mass suggestion. It was exposure. And as more testimonies emerged, a new possibility took shape. One officials had carefully avoided. The town had not simply been relocated away from something. It had been placed around it. The truth did not arrive as a confession. It arrived as a pattern. Independent researchers, historians, acoustics experts, retired civil engineers began overlaying timelines, evacuation dates, infrastructure upgrades, funding cycles, seismic anomalies, health reports. When aligned, they told a story no single document ever admitted. The town sat above a geological fault, unlike others in the region. Not unstable in the traditional sense, but resonant. The rock layers amplified specific low-frequency vibrations, carrying them farther, deeper, longer than expected. Years earlier, this had attracted attention. What began as passive observation turned into controlled testing. Equipment was installed underground to stimulate and measure resonance. The effects were subtle at first, barely noticeable, categorized as safe, until they weren't. The vibrations interacted with the human nervous system in unpredictable ways. Sleep cycles disrupted, perception altered, sensory thresholds shifted. Not enough to trigger alarms, but enough to be measured. The town wasn't the target. It was the instrument. A population in place provided real-time data no laboratory could replicate. Daily routines, long-term exposure, generational effects. And when the data grew concerning, the response wasn't shut down. It was isolation. Relocation minimized liability. Erasure reduced questions. Preservation maintained the site. And the testing never fully stopped. Energy readings recorded years after evacuation showed continued activity, lower intensity, longer intervals. Maintenance logs referenced calibration cycles. Someone was still listening. A leaked internal summary, circulated briefly before disappearing, contained a chilling line. Civilian presence accelerated outcomes. Accelerated toward what it didn't say. As public interest grew, access tightened again. Roads closed temporarily. Monitoring equipment upgraded. Warnings reissued, this time firmer. The town's return to obscurity was swift. But now, people understood enough to be afraid. The purpose was not destruction. It was understanding limits. How much sound the ground could carry. How much vibration a body could absorb. How much disruption a community could endure before breaking. And one final realization emerged, the most disturbing of all. If this site had been worth preserving, there were likely others. In the end, there was no official reckoning. No tribunal. No apology delivered with names attached. No document that fully admitted what had been done. There were only closures. Files marked resolved. Budgets reallocated. Sites renamed. The town's designation changed one final time from active to dormant. Not decommissioned. Not erased again. Just dormant. As if waiting were a condition built into it. Former residents aged. Some passed away. Others stopped speaking publicly. Not because they were silenced, but because repetition had exhausted them. Explaining the same loss, the same absence, the same disbelief became heavier than silence. Children who had once drawn tunnels grew up. Some avoided cities. Some sought careers in sound, geology, medicine, trying to understand sensations they still couldn't fully name. The town itself continued to stand. Weather wore at it slowly. Paint peeled. Roofs sagged. But the core remained intact, protected, monitored, untouched by time in ways that defied neglect. Occasionally someone drove near the perimeter. The signs were vague now. Warnings softened into suggestions. Nothing explicitly forbidden. Curiosity lingered. So did the hum. Low. Persistent. Almost patient. Researchers still debated what had truly been learned. The data was fragmented, compartmentalized, locked behind classifications that outlived the people who created them. What was clear, however, was what had been lost. A community dismantled without consent. A shared history edited out of record. Lives treated as variables. The question was no longer whether it had been justified. It was whether anyone would ever be held accountable, and whether future towns, quiet, ordinary places, might one day discover that they, too, were built for reasons never disclosed. The town had been many things. A home, a test site, a warning. Now it was a reminder that progress often moves faster than ethics, that silence can be engineered, that some places disappear not because they collapse, but because someone decides they are useful that way, and somewhere beneath the ground, something continued to resonate. Not loudly, not urgently, just enough to be remembered by those who knew how to listen.